All right. Welcome. I am really happy to have all of you with us. We'll probably have more people joining as we go along. My name is Mary Beth Gassman. It is a pleasure to be with you. I am a professor at Rutgers University. I also have the honor of serving as the executive director of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice. And we are sponsoring this event today. The event is Pandemic Positives in Education, What We Have Learned. And I'm really, really excited because we have two amazing speakers who have authored a wonderful new book. And we have with us today Karen Gross, who is an educator and an author and an artist. And I want to say that I've known Karen for years. She's been a college president. She has authored children's books. She is a prolific writer and just someone who brings joy to all the conversations that she's a part of. I am meeting Edward Wang for the first time. He is a professor at Harvard Medical School. He is working with Karen on this project, really excited from our initial meeting to see how he's going to contribute today. And I want to say that I will be moderating the Q&A along with Natalie Passoff, who works with us at the Proctor Institute. Please put your questions, and we hope you have a lot of them, in the Q&A, and we will answer them after the presentation. So I am going to hand it over to the wonderful Karen and Ed. Enjoy.
So thank you, Mary Beth, and welcome everyone. It's very nice to be with you all and sharing our new book with you. Before we get to the substance, and I want Ed to say hello too, this cover slide has an important image that speaks to the issues within the book itself. And it's worth noting that the book is filled with art. That's very intentional, because as you'll see, art is one of the pandemic positives that we identified. So Ed, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. And first of all, I just want to deeply say hello to all of you who's participating. We will have a wonderful time, I hope. And, Karen and I, we spent certainly many years together and spent the past about 2 years, writing this book. So one of the features that you might see is that when we show the slide, let's say that Karen would say something and I would say something, then I might just say, hey, Karen, remember when we were talking or writing in our book? That's the piece that I'm quite impressed when you brought it up, Karen, in our book. So I would say that you will see some interaction among myself and Karen. You know what? When you together for 2 years writing the book, we know each other a lot. And so I think you will get a flavor of that during our presentation. And then, of course, you are very welcome to, have your Q&A to send in at different times. Whenever you think you are ready to do that, just send it in. We have a support team here that they're going to, capture whatever things that are being put in, and then we will do our best at the end of our presentation to answer, your questions or reflecting on your comments and so forth. So I just want to highlight that. So let me quickly then, thank you for Karen for showing this dream catcher. So I'm going to share with you an oral history or oral story of the Ojibwe tribe of the Native American Indians. And as you all know that this is a dream catcher, and the traditional oral history about Dreamcatcher is that the night sky and the night air is filled with dreams, good ones as well as bad ones. And as its names say, calling Dreamcatcher, the purpose then is to catches all the dreams that are both positives and negatives. And the idea is really to protect our children or the children that is, having these night dreams. And of course, the beautiful dreams that will pass through the threads that you can see, and then it slides through the feathers on the side, and then it will, go into the head of the child. Those are the good dreams. And then the bad dreams are being captured through the threads to these little, I just use beads. I made these for my granddaughters while I was in Shanghai during the pandemic. And so the beads represent the bad dreams that got captured and crystallized. And then, of course, the next morning and next afternoon, the sun will burn them off. Now, why did I choose this image? It is because that in our book, we talk about pandemic positives. So if you look at it, it's an example of the good dreams, the dreams that can really nurture children, nurture students, for them to grow and to be successful. That's why we actually use this image somewhere in our book, that upcoming book will be published in September. So Karen, thank you.
All right, let's go to the next slide. And before we formally talk about the book, I do want to just say a special thank you to Mary Beth Gassman and her team for enabling us to share our work with you. Mary Beth has been remarkable at doing that. And so I just wanted to add a very personal thank you. One of the things that happened during the pandemic when Ed and I were teaching, and we run something called the Virtual Teachers Lounge, where we listen to the voices of teachers, we saw not only the negative things that happened in education to a number of students as well as educators. And the news captured those negatives in great detail. But what we started seeing is a number of positive things that came out of the pandemic. But many of those positives, we in our book address 30 of them, although one source that we cite in the book saw over 3,000 of them globally. What we felt is that these positives kept getting lost when we returned after schools were shut down, then went online, then hybrid, and then back in person. Many of the pandemic positives got discarded. And the book is an effort to not only identify those pandemic positives, but to find ways to make them stick. They can replicate them, scale them, and enable them to have stickiness. So, and I should also add, this book is in the trenches real, in the sense that this is not pure theory. This is grounded in the practice of education from pre-K all the way through adult education. And it's a counter narrative to the negatives about the pandemic and trying to point out how those positives can be used to mend education, thus the title of the book. Anything else you want to say about that before we launch?
Yes, Karen, I just want to expand a little bit in terms of what you said, in terms of the, why did we, write this book? Well, I will continue with my, catches the positive, right? The positive dreams. And these are not dreams. These are actually realities that we learn from, our colleagues in the trenches experience of educators as well as administrators, school administrator. And we actually started on that in 2020 during the spring term. And we continue to run the Virtual Teachers Lounge even up to now. So we learned a lot, we heard a lot, and we share a lot, with the educators and among ourselves. So a lot of these are really crystallized as something very positive. And these are not, I'm not being Pollyanna. I have a tendency to look at positives and work towards how to sustain them rather than looking at negatives and maybe feeling at times, being kind of punitive in a way. So I just want to kind of share it with you that this is through the experience of your colleagues throughout the pandemic. The other piece I just also very quickly mention is that the reason we want to do that is to put these positives to scale, both in terms of policy, program, and practice. Okay, Karen.
Let's go to the next slide. And I just want to say one thing before we turn to these positives. Just to be clear, we are not negating the negatives. And there were many negatives that hurt low-income students, that had an impact on racial parity, equity, diversity, inclusion. There is no question but that many of the negatives of the pandemic did that. But the positives can also help in these very areas. So we appreciate and recognize the negatives that occurred, but we want to put a spotlight on the positives. So here is a sampling of 5 of the positives, and then we're going to go through each one here. The first has to do with the importance of social and emotional learning. The second has to do with how the pandemic changed how we think about seat time, chunking of material, and space flexing, whether online or in person. Third, we'll focus on assessment and changes to assessment. Fourth, we'll focus on the value that the pandemic taught us about understanding who our students and their families are. And lastly, we'll talk about educator readiness and support to be able to carry the pandemic positives forward. I do want to note, and Ed reminds me regularly of this, that we've added lots of endnotes and a further reading list to the book, because many educators found that when they went to do things, their administrators said, "Where's the support for this?" And so what we did is we provided that support. It obviously can be shared and looked at. And I just want to give you one funny example of that. I did a program at Sonoma State, and I suggested the use of fidgets and other, tactile things to activate the senses. And one of the professors went and, bought some of those, found them very effective in his class. And then he went to his department chair to get funding. And the department chair said, "Well, where's the academic literature supporting the use of fidgets?" And he wrote me a note and said, "Where's the academic support for the use of fidgets?" And I sent it to him. And I should add, he got reimbursed. So anything, Ed, on this slide before we go to the next?
Yeah, let me actually again expand on what Karen said. Again, as I said earlier, there's so much in the book itself. It's a privilege for me to write this together with Karen. So we went back and forth a lot in regard to what is this book about. But I just want to emphasize that one of my key elements, because of my training and so forth, is making certain that this book is written based on science. And that's important. We talk about, in my world, we talk about it as evidence-based practice. And so this is not gimmicks. This is not, on the level of saying that, well, geez, this is kind of like a self-help book. It is not. It is much more than that. It is about the science behind what we do and what we shared. The other thing I just want to mention that it is based on the lived experience of Karen and I. As a matter of fact, we have a small bit, maybe a page or two, talking about our lived experience that applies into the real world, that applies into education. And I just have to share with you that, and you will actually read in the book, is that, my lived experience is one is a member, a family member, that my family, a member actually died because of depression and died by suicide while in college. And this was about almost now 52 years ago. As a matter of fact, that is actually 52 years ago that happened to my brother. As a matter of fact, it was March 6th. So it was just a week ago or something like that. So I think there is an aspect of human story we presented in terms of our own human story, or I call that, or many people call that as a lived experience. But that really ties into education. And it ties into, certainly our major thesis of this book when we talk about, depression, emotional wellness, and so forth. And then the other piece I want to highlight is that because I born in Hong Kong and came to the United States for education, so I have a very different, family and cultural background and so forth, which also made me, as well as Karen shared that wonderfully with me, is to talk about racial, ethnic, linguistic kind of inequities that is happening, that is also we like to, is part of I felt like it's part of my mission to do a number of shout outs and places in the book to really describe the disparity. But also on top of that, we have solutions. I think that's the most important part. When I say we means all of you. Together with us, we have solutions. Back to you, Karen.
Sure. I just want to note, we also conducted a survey. That's a really complicated set of scientific information in there, but we did a survey. We had 150 plus responses to a survey of educators. We have a diverse group who responded, and we have supported our findings with not only the data, but with their words because of the open-ended questions. So I just wanted to share that survey is a valuable tool for thinking about ensuring that what we're saying is rooted in the lived experience of educators. So let's go to the next slide. We will come back actually to this slide. So this is a diagram Ed created, and the title to this slide actually tells you a really important part of how we think about this. There, you can think about the pandemic positives really as the 3 M's and the 3 P's. The 3 M's are the micro practice, which takes place in classrooms, the meso practice, which takes place in schools, in writ large, or your school system. And then macro is at the policy level, whether that's statewide, could be district-wide, or even federal government. And then you can see it's identified not only as micro, meso, and macro, but implemented in practice, in programs, and in policy. And all of this derives from Ed's own work in mental wellness. So I'm going to let Ed share how he came up with these in his own field, and we transported them into education.
Okay, thank you. And yes, this is actually, if we look at, education as public education, I mean, there's certainly private education institution as well. But my work for a number of years as the public stewards in regard to mental health in Massachusetts. And then later on, actually, I was part of the National Council, specifically on mental health issues. This is where it comes from, because I have the privilege through doing my public stewardship. I learned a lot about the micro practice, which I'm familiar because I'm trained as a clinical psychologist. Meso, which I encounter because the type of programming is out, in the real world, in the community. And of course, later on, really got involved a lot of national as well as state policy in public mental health. So that is my experience, and we work hard between Karen and I to transform, some of these experience into how we consider in regard in education. Now, of course, I'm not, at all an expert, unlike Karen, in all these 3 areas. But what we found is that what I have done in mental health, which is interesting because I think we will talk about some of the mental wellness of students as well as teachers and their families, because that is highly related to, student success as well, academic success, and also in terms of personal and future career growth and development. So I think that we decided to, actually dedicate maybe a chapter or so specifically looking at some of the parallel process when it comes to policy, program, and practice. And those are the 3 Ps that I use. And if we have any of the participants here from the School of Social Work, and this will be you are something very familiar. And I learned that actually your 3 Ms is so similar to our 3 Ps. Back to you, Karen.
Sure. Before we turn to the next slide, I just want to say something for those who are sports fans. You, you can make forward motion with the pandemic positives using any one of the 3. But if you truly want robust undertaking of the pandemic positives, it has to happen at the micro, meso, and macro level. I say to people, if you think about baseball, if you just have micro practices, that means good hitters, that's good. But if you don't have a defense who can catch the other people's hits, then you have a failure there, and then the game doesn't happen. So while any one of these is valuable, you need all 3 to be working to get true stickiness. So let's go to the next slide.
I don't know that you are a baseball guru too. See, I learned little bit about everything each time when Karen and I doing that. I guess the 2 year of writing is not enough. Now I have to put another thing about, hey, we have a baseball guru here. I know that she is interested in basketball, and she was actually yesterday was watching in person a game down in is that a game down in Atlanta?
Atlantic City. I'm still in
Atlantic
Atlantic
City, yeah.
City. Yeah. And actually, there are sports analogies and medical analogies throughout the book. All right.
That's so true. Yeah.
So here we are on our pandemic positives. And the easy way to remember them is an acronym. Remembering, by the way, that they reflect on diversity. We've thought about them through the lens of diversity and diversity in all senses. So we created the acronym SAVE, as in what will save education, mend education. And we're going to, in a minute, go through social and emotional learning, seat time and chunking, assessment, the value of knowing students and families, and educator readiness and support. So let's turn to the next slide before we go back to this slide in a minute. So I'm going to let Ed define these for you, but let me just say that before the 5 examples that we have in the word save are pandemic positives we uncovered. What we also uncovered is that there are 2 really significant pandemic positives, perhaps the greatest gifts of the pandemic to us. And these can and do and should exist in education. And they are hope and creativity. So I'm going to let Ed share with you our definitions and thinking on hope and creativity. But let me also add, while some people were aware of hope and creativity as they progressed as educators through the pandemic, there is no doubt but that every educator, or not every, most, felt that we were building the plane as we were flying. And as we built the plane to take education through the pandemic, hope and creativity are truly its biggest gifts. So Ed, share with folks what hope is and what creativity is as we use them.
Yeah, I think for the purpose of continuity of what we talked about, and when I mentioned that, the book is really grounded on science or scientific theory. Interesting enough, the process when we identify hope and creativity as the 2 precursor positives, It took a while, actually. I think it took a while almost to the end when we almost finished the first draft. When reviewing it, after 200 plus pages, we saying that, aren't we talking about some themes here, some precursors when we talk about the pandemic positives, the 30 plus of them. Guess what? We both agree that, are we talking about hope? We're asking ourselves, are we talking about hope? Are we talking about creativities that we have seen and heard from teachers? And through, as I mentioned, the virtual teachers lounge, for the past 2.5 years. And that's how we generated and saying, you know what, these two precursors are actually quite important. And as a matter of fact, in the chapter that is really dedicated specifically about, these two precursors, we actually have a subtitle called The Unspoken Greats, Unspoken Greats, Hope and Creativity. That's where we honed in. So at that point, I said, Karen, I know that you are an artist. So how do you define hope? And how do you define creativity? And I think one of the things that we learn from each other is that, I'm very much of a right brain or left brain person, and Karen is much more of a right brain person, that we specialize in terms of what we do. You can see some of our, descriptions, and even maybe here when we talk, this guy sounds a little bit more logical and then all these things. And Karen is so, artistic and so forth. And that's what it is. So I said that, wait a minute here. If our book is grounded about evidence-based or scientific theory, let me go in and look at, and in our book, we have to define the definition of hope and creativity. And here it is. Hope, according to the American Psychological Association, and I'll just read this because, they're their words, and I think it's very well described, the definition of hope. Hope is the expectation that one will have positive experiences or that a potentially threatening or negative situation will not materialize or will ultimately result in a favorable state of affairs. And this, in some sense, set the premise when we talk about pandemic positives. And when we're looking at, we all share this highly threatening, anxious, negative, really a time of an era that when we were dealing with pandemics. Now, we certainly broadened that as well as some of the issues related to social determinants that impact race and ethnicity in education and in many arenas, which we will be talk a little bit later. Now, creativity is even a harder one. But I think both she and I agree is that creativity is a process, not an ability. It is about problem solving and not only thinking outside the box, but also discarding the box itself at some times. It is not limited to new or original ideas. It can transform what others have done or connect things from the past in new ways. And I certainly have seen a lot in terms of some of the things that we mentioned in education. A lot of these strategies have mentioned, developed, researched in the past. The question is that how do we bring that forward, or maybe in a more new ways or adaptive ways in the future? Karen, I'm going to go back to you. Any additional things that you would like to add?
So I want to emphasize that hope isn't flighty. Hope is a real sense of our capacity to believe in the future. And creativity is not limited to the arts. Creativity can take many forms. It can be in medicine, it can be in business. We focus on creativity in the fields of mental health and education, but just to be aware, both hope and creativity cross over the disciplines. So let's go to the next slide.
Before you go there, Karen, I would like to actually talk a little bit about crisis creativity. I think we mentioned in our book, and I think that is a relevant area for us to think it through, when we talk about creativity, especially during the pandemic.
Okay, so it's a good thing we co-authored this book. Okay, so crisis creativity, we define creativity, but we create a definition of a new term, crisis creativity. And the idea of crisis creativity is that negative events actually create opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist. And we would be wise when there are crises to pay attention to how we respond to them. And that doesn't mean we can't have creativity without crisis. We certainly can. But creativity in the context of a crisis allows for an opportunity to do things, think about things, manage things in different ways. And actually, I think the term crisis creativity, while new as a phraseology, is one that has enormous power as we move forward in time. The pandemic will not be our only crisis. So amongst all the many things we can learn better now how to prepare for the crises of the future. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And now what we're going to do is go back up a few slides, hang on a sec, to go over each of the save items that are the 5 of the 30 pandemic positives we share overall. But just to focus on the art for a moment, there are many pieces of art in the book created by me and by Ed. And it's in essence to not only bring home the message of creativity and the use of art, which is one sure pandemic positive strategy, but also because the art in and of itself messages, and this particular piece of art should allow you to think about how we became buttoned up, or in some cases unbuttoned, because of the pandemic in terms of our feelings and in terms of our thoughts. So if you're too buttoned up, you're overregulated. If you're totally unbuttoned, you're dysregulated. And if you have no buttons or aren't even focused on your buttons, you're disassociated. And so the artwork, which you could call trauma art, is an effort to think about trauma symptomology as expressed in artwork. So now if we just go back up a few slides to the listing of the 5, there we go. Okay, so what we're going to do now in the next 20 minutes or so is take you through each of these so that we end by 2-ish and then allow for your questions. We could do these in almost any order. I'm actually thinking we'll start with assessment today. So let me share assessment with you. So one of the things that happened during the pandemic, as most of you who are educators know, we couldn't do standardized testing the way we used to do it. And when that testing disappeared from the landscape, and by the way, students in pre-K through 12 take over 100 standardized tests over the course of their education in public schools. That's a lot of tests per year. What happened is we started thinking about different forms of assessment. So one of the forms of assessment we started thinking about was oral assessments. Another is portfolio assessments. Another is progress assessment, not absolute knowledge acquisition, but growth from where a student was to where a student is now. And one of the things that happened is that when educators were freed up from having to, quote, teach to the test or focus on standardized assessments, there was a lot of creativity and hope that they could come up with, as they did with new forms of assessment. Sadly, as with other pandemic positives, when the pandemic waned, we got rid of many of those alternative forms of assessment and returned to the standardized tests, which, by the way, no shock, showed that there was no growth in reading or math, and there was a decline, a differential decline based on issues of race and ethnicity. But what if we had measured progress? What if we had measured social and emotional learning? What if we measured what really counts? So for me, assessment is one of the pandemic positives that if we can carry it forward, we'll have a better way of measuring our students. And now I leave it to Ed to talk about what we learned about social and emotional learning.
Yeah, and then let me just expand a little bit about assessment. This is actually an very interesting topic for me. As I mentioned, that I was educated in Hong Kong. Of course, this is way back, 50 plus years ago. And yes, I'm actually much older than I look. And I think what happened is this. I was privileged to actually went back to Hong Kong actually during the pandemic, early part of the pandemic. And what I found out talking to educators there is that, certainly I think there's always an emphasis in terms of STEM education and also measuring, right, the level of success in the STEM areas. One of the educators actually developed some programs that mentioned to me now they are using STEAM, STEAM. The A out of the STEM, as we all know, A is actually art, which is very interesting. And this becoming stick in my mind that even, in Hong Kong or in Asia that are so focused in terms of STEM education, they are beginning to find the value of arts. And this is the part that I believe, and it's mentioned many times, and I strongly believe, is the development of a whole brain child. And I think that tucks into some of the things that when Karen talked about assessment, different types of assessment, what are we exactly measuring, and so forth. And I just kind of want to expand on her thesis in regard to assessment. So with that said, she mentioned that, well, let's meet to talk about the social and emotional learning. Well, we all know that students, whether it's, kindergarteners all the way to, high school, this is their time of social emotional development. And we also know that social and emotional balance of a student is one of the key indicators of mental wellness. So as a matter of fact that and I'm really into this about defining mental wellness based on some of the very specific area. And one of them is social and emotional development. And as a matter of fact that the book also talk about other areas that I think they are critical towards academic success. So with that said, that we know that not social and emotional balance is a key indicator of mental wellness, but mental wellness is also a key indicator of academic success. In terms of, let me specify this, in terms of there's a relationship between mental wellness and academic success or learning. If we don't even talk about, what success means, it is about mental wellness and higher capacity to learn. So I just want to kind of emphasize that with that regard. And Karen, do you want to talk about seat time and chunking before we go to, about students, families, and educators?
Or let me just add something on social and emotional learning. For pre-pandemic, for many schools, content was king or queen. One of the things we learned is the value of social and emotional learning. And in fact, there were a number of educators who employed social and emotional learning strategies before teaching content. And let me add that many of them also developed a way to integrate content learning with social and emotional learning. And what happened pre-pandemic was that social and emotional learning in some areas was marginalized in some schools as not important. And one of the things the pandemic taught us is these kids will, adults too, will not be able to learn if we don't give them enough balance in terms of their social and emotional well-being. And for those who figured this all out during the pandemic, they saw that you could integrate social and emotional learning. It's not like you taught it as a separate thing, but you could teach it as part of your content pedagogy. Now, in terms of seat time and chunking and space flexing, one of the things that online learning did, as much as it did wrong, it did give us an awareness that the standard seat time, often, by the way, required by educators, isn't necessarily optimal for learning, nor is being actually in a seat, as in a chair. Some people learn well standing up, or some people will learn well sitting on the floor, and some people learn well by a shorter period of time rather than a longer period of time. And then, because of the way online learning worked and the way people could click in and click out, teaching material in smaller rather than larger chunks improved learning. In other words, it's sort of less is more. If you could take what you learn and instead of stretching it out over 45 minutes and chunk it instead into more manageable pieces, the learning could be enhanced. And lastly, through breakout rooms and chat rooms, we realized that some students actually did better online, not all by any stretch, but some did better and many did the same by being able to go into a breakout room, to be able to work with one another in a space, for an educator to be able to take a student or two separate from what the main group was doing. So online learning gave us insights and improvements by changing how we think about seat time, changing how we think about how much material we offer, and changing the space we occupy to teach effectively. All of which we are not, carry forward in time post-pandemic. And sadly, much of this learning is being discarded with the idea that, oh, we did that during the pandemic, we don't need that now. And part of the book is to share, not only is it important then, it's important now, and how do we get it to be sticky? Okay, let's go to the value of students and families.
May I just jump in a little bit to just actually mention, we did mention earlier about our survey. And as the matter of fact that in the survey, we want to see, you know, how did teachers explore the area of social and emotional experience of students during the pandemic. And what we learned is that during the pandemic time, during the different phases of education, whether it is virtual, hybrid, and then of course later return back to the brick and mortar, what we found is that actually teachers pay a lot of attention to the social and emotional experience of their students. And I just want to kind of highlight that even though I think some of them would tell us that, yeah, you know what, they were trained, but they were not, this is pre-pandemic now. They were trained about this. And as a matter of fact, we know schools have curriculums for teachers and students about that. They were not really practiced consistently throughout different school, even within school. And the pandemic itself, because of all the uncertainty and anxieties and also losses and so forth, the issues of mental wellness was raised, on top of almost blinking on the radar screen. And how then, they define, mental wellness is that many teachers beginning to look at social and emotional experience of their students at home, online, as well as even outside of the home environment, which actually brings us to, the value of knowing students and families.
So to add to this, one of the pluses when schools were shut or when schools were online is that educators had a different window, a different opportunity to learn who their students and families actually were. And it's sort of like when we say, speak to your audience, know your audience. Well, this is about speak to your students, understand who your students are and who their families are. So many educators spoke about going to students' homes to drop off materials, learning more about their parents, learning about the environment and communities in which they were living. But then when they were online, they also saw family fights, family struggles, parents who went on screen wearing clothing that was, totally inappropriate for school, let alone walking around a home. And they saw fighting and they saw tension and they saw disputes. So educators got a much more wraparound knowledge. And if you have that knowledge, you're way more able to educate, because behavior is the language of trauma. And if you understand what undergirds student behavior, you can do a way better job educating them. And that gets us to, how do you get educators ready and supported to do this work? Because I want to make sure we get through the slide deck by 2. Talk a little bit about educator readiness and support, Ed.
Yeah, you know what? Before I go there, I really encourage you, again, continue to submit your questions in the question and answers, anything that you have. I think that we would love to hear what you have to say or questions that you have for us and so forth. This is really about mutual learning. I think we want to emphasize that. So let me actually quickly move, because I think Karen, I think we have, a couple more slides, but some of that is actually on a, 3M's issue or 3Ps. I think we can actually, talk a little bit less about that just for today, because it will be great to hear what people have to say. I have to say that I think it's hard for me to imagine what educators went through, during the pandemic. And they have to adjust, and with hope and creativities. And, they were doing a fantastic job. And I also want to emphasize that this is more than when we talk about educators, just think about teachers. We also, talk about, the guidance counselors. We also talk about the school psychologist, and we talk about coaches, we talk about nurses and all the support that they need. And let me just really focus on the support. The work is hard. Education is hard. Many of these issues is prior to pandemic. And the question that we often come between Ken and I in discussion is that how do we provide educator support? And I guess one of the, we have been using this, and sometimes I just say, do we want to use it again or not? When you are, up in the air, the announcement is that you want to put the air mask onto yourself first before you help the person next to it. And I think that I just want to echo what Karen said about trauma, because I think many educators experience what we call something called secondary trauma of what they saw, experienced, and heard, from their students and their families. Karen?
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. We got to slide through a few to get back to where we were. Keep going. Okay, so we put together everything we've said so far. into a three-legged stool. And there's, by the way, a rich history of three-legged stools and their remarkable stability. But what we did is we thought about what are the sort of consistent themes throughout all the pandemic positives, if you were to narrow them down. And if we could do that, what we would have in essence is a prototype for how to think about the changes in education that have stickiness and lasting power. So here's our three-legged stool. One leg stands for creativity. One stands for connection, multiple connections, connection student to student, student to teacher, teacher to family. And the last one is community, and the connection, reciprocal connection between educational communities and the larger community. Now, if you have all three of those, creativity, connection, and community, and sitting on the top of the stool is trust, which is what undergirds all of this, right? If there's no trust, no safety, no support, then it's very hard to do this. But a way to assess educational programming moving forward to achieve equity in the form of racial equity and ethnic and economic equity and a diverse community, you can think of the three-legged stool. And actually, I keep little stools on my desk, dollhouse kind of size, in an effort to remind myself that what you really need in thinking about educational change is you need connection, creativity, and community. Ed?
Yeah, and I just want to maybe add the about connection and community. And I just first of all want to highlight trust. Trust is a critical ingredient when we want to connect, in different communities. I guess I'm blessed in some ways that I work in a very urban environment that is both socially, well, I would say is very low resource, low income community. So in order for me to engage with them, trust is a critical strategies or investment to do that. And I'm not going to go into details, and many of you know, especially when you work in urban school setting in the low income area, is the whole issues of social determinants. And that really impact, and if you look at social determinants, it's not only about impact health, but it is also impact in terms of education, as well as social and emotional growth. Anyway, so let's move on.
Add something else. Wait. I want to just mention something else about this piece of art. The blue things at the bottom there, that's actually a mat of social and emotional learning that undergirds all of education. And one of the things about the three-legged stool and its stability is that to have stability in education, you need to be grounded in social and emotional learning. So that's why the stool actually sits right in the midst of social and emotional learning. It isn't different things, they're integrated, which gets to the next slide. All right, this is the part we have to shortchange very quickly here and then get to the last slide about Juicy and Kintsugi. Okay, it's not simple to make the pandemic positives stick. Long story short, and there are many pathways to do it. In fact, one should use more than one pathway to get the pandemic positives to stick. And so, Ed, do you want to speak about some of these pathways briefly?
Yeah, let me jump around a little bit, and then please do, Karen, add anything else. I'm going to go very quickly with this. This is a term that I use particularly for public policy, as well as funding. Because a lot of times my constituents will say, "Oh gosh, what you're saying is wonderful, great. Well, we agree with you, but this is an unfunded mandate." So, and the whole process, I was always see it as from my perspective. In my head, what I'm doing, what the community partnership about, and engagement and so forth, it is a marathon and not a sprint. I ran a couple marathons here in Boston, so I guess I use that kind of an analogy. I would say if you ask me some of the most important features about engagement, and this is not only about engagement with community, this is engagement with students, which is also, we surveyed that. And we also survey about trust and engagement at two different items. It's important for us to establish, as Karen mentioned, about that trust in the three-legged stool, building relationships, that connectedness. But hey, all that is about how we communicate and how we message in terms of what we do. You know what? Let me stop since I already picked two. Karen, you go ahead.
Well, let me talk a little bit about leadership. One of the things that did come up is that some educators on the ground didn't feel their leaders understood them or what they were trying to do. So how to think about improving leadership, which is something, by the way, that the Proctor Institute and the Graduate School of Education are focusing on, actually aspiring leaders. That's a critical part to making education a success. So I want to just say thank you to Rutgers for doing that, but also it's critically needed. But the other one is you can't make change without being inclusive. And I have, since Ed shared it with me, been stuck by a story he tells about being at a meeting where everybody who, the talking heads were talking, and a woman in the audience raised her hand and said, I'm one of the people you're talking about. Don't make changes without me. So no changes about me without me is a very powerful statement, and one really worth putting up on one's wall. So let's go to the next slide. This is a piece of kintsugi pottery. Jusi is the Chinese version of this, inserting metal hinges into broken pieces. Kintsugi is the mending of pottery by putting gold on the cracks so that you can say more beautiful for being broken. And that's really the lesson that the pandemic positives give us, that we can mend education, improve education, if we take the steps we describe. So just like kintsugi makes a broken pot more beautiful, or makes peace, P-E-A-C-E, out of pieces, so too can we do that with education. Ed?
What Karen said, I just want to set that, the Suji repair or mending, I think the key word here we always come back is to mending. Why do we need to mend rather than throw it away? So I think that's one thing. And I think we actually, in our last slide, we did mention that there's a lot of good things have been done in the past that we need to continue to preserve. And that's really the purpose of mending. And of course, then, after we mend, what that bowl is going to be like, what is that like now in terms of a mending bowl? And then in the future, is that, where is that going to go with what's being mended? And I think that it's kind of captured in terms of kind of our both visual as well as maybe artistic expression of these very traditional techniques with China and ceramics and so forth of mending.
So, and thus the title of the book, Mending Education, is a play off of the statement in both kintsugi and jusi that we can be more beautiful for being broken, but we must be mended, not discarded. So if we go to the next slide, before we go to questions. Here's the information on the new book. There's the pre-order site. There's the code for the discount. By the way, I forgot I knew it was ME 2024. I couldn't figure out me. Then I kept thinking, what a weird thing. Then I realized, oh, whoops, it's Mending Education. Good idea of theirs. Okay, and then you go to the next slide. So Ed and I always welcome ideas or thoughts. We hope you'll ask questions now and into the future. And I can say with full capacity that we both respond relatively quickly to all outreach. So please feel free to do so. Before we end and take your questions, I just want to say I hope this was helpful and useful to you all, and that you learned something that will enrich the work that you are doing. And I thank you for the work you are doing and hope this book will help with it. Ed?
Yes, I echo in terms of what Karen said. As I reemphasize that we learned that, from all of you, from your colleagues and others, during the pandemic, looking at some of the wonderful strategies that were used. And we really would like, as we used the title Mending Education, that how can we mend and move forward?
Well, thank you both so much. This was definitely an incredible conversation. I certainly learned a lot from you both. And I definitely learned a little bit more about you personally, which I wasn't really expecting, but I definitely enjoyed all the sports analogies. So I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat. Please, I want to urge folks to put any questions that you may have in the chat. We have plenty of time for Q&A here. Just a note that we did put the information to the book, the link and the discount code in the chat, so you can access that directly there. So to kick us off, I'm wondering, well, there's someone in the Q&A here that asks, in your findings, did the pandemic allow for more personalized individual attention from the teachers for the students?
Well, I'll take this one. The answer is an affirmative yes. There was lots more opportunity for personalized, individualized education. And it came in several ways. One, it came from knowing more about your students. Because if you know who your students and family are, you can be more personal in how you educate them. The other way that it became personal is through space, the way we used space online. And it allowed for educators to actually work with smaller numbers of students in flex space than previously was available. And then while many people object to this sort of thing, when educators went to students' homes or saw them, there was an opportunity to share with them in a very different, personal way their learning and to help them with their problems. I mean, there's a very well-known picture of a math teacher teaching a student through the window because the student was struggling with her math problem. The teacher's holding up a whiteboard and helping the student through the glass window how to do the math problem. That's personalized education. So yes, it allowed for that, and we shouldn't lose that.
And I want to add to that about that, really a very good question. And the word used is personalized. This is actually it's a very interesting thing I think the pandemic did to all of us. Remember when we were, encouraged or comply with, physical distancing, right? We would say, wow, geez, now we limit ourselves. We could not even socialize and da, 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 da. So all the negatives, which is true, because of health, infectious protections and so forth. But if you look at from the another perspective, is that what make us then different. And even with virtual, right? The students, Karen mentioned some of the things that we heard about, teachers telling us that, they're seeing, the backgrounds and the family, and while, when education was done online, actually the opposite is also true. Students saying that, oh, wow, you know what? I learned something different about my teacher because the teacher was using his or her own environment, and or they, to be inclusive here, and that's a whole different experience. So you get personalized to a different degree. Now I seeing my teachers. Oh, my teachers! I'm going to just play it with Karen. Well, my teachers has sports trophy behind. Oh, I did not know that my teacher was an athlete. So in that sense, it becomes very personalized. That's how I look at that word when one of the participant mentioned. Um, I think it's also very personalized, and I think that that is something that prompted us to write this book in a more of a interpersonal level. It is about we all share the same uncertainty and the resultant anxiety, and certainly some was economically being impacted, and unfortunately some even lost a significant other or someone that is meaningful to them, including educators that were lost during the pandemic. It's become so personalized to everyone that I think that the pandemics made that happen to us. So I think there's a lot of that we can learn from it. And the fact is that we share that, in the book with all of you, is that personalizations. And Karen, I noticed that you were going to say something.
Yeah, I thank you. Pick it up. We know each other very well. I wanted to just add something. And it's a very good question. One of the things that happened is that the traditional boundaries of student and educator changed because they shared a negative experience, the pandemic. And out of Katrina, when therapists and clients suddenly had shared loss of homes, flooding, closures, there's a kind of personalization and understanding that comes out of that that's really important. And one of the exercises that we talk about is the ask me anything question as a way of recognizing feelings, that students should be able to ask their educators anything, and as long as it's within the realm of decency, the educator will answer. That's about the reciprocal personalization that Ed talked about. So
Yes, and I think that if we look at it, is that from a kind of a social and emotional experience, we call that SEL, the learning and so forth. Is that part of that? It's enable us to build a stronger bond and connecting to each other, teachers and students and so forth. And this is where we hope, now what, a year into, back to school and so forth, the importance of the bonding, right? That connecting, we want to see that continue. The question is, how do you do that? And I think that there are creative ways to do that and so forth. And we touch on that in terms of some of the creative way that teachers have been doing, even prior to pandemic, in terms of how to engage. I think we probably use that word a lot in the book itself. How do you engage? And actually that's a survey question as well, the engagement.
So we just talked a little bit about the student experience. I'm seeing a question in the chat here about the educators. So when referring to social and emotional assessments, were educators also assessed? If not, hypothetically, would the outcome of the evaluation be inferred in their creative system to better understand their students?
Oh, I think it's fair to say that educators have struggled throughout the pandemic, and we did not pay enough attention to their social and emotional well-being. And in fact, the flight of educators is a devastating consequence of the pandemic. There's no question about that. And we did not give enough credence to the importance of self-care for educators as they were managing the pandemic, because many of them had their own trauma, as well as dealing with the trauma of their students. And it's one of the hardest things for me is that we are losing quality educators because we didn't pay enough attention to their mental wellness. And the example that we use in the book is that when educators started experiencing trouble in a classroom and just thought they couldn't deal with it anymore, they had been given a red circle of paper, and they would take that red circle of paper and either bring it to the teacher in the next classroom or down the hall to the administrator's office and literally walk out the door. And then the remaining teachers had to pick up the classroom of the students that that educator left. And one of the things that happened because of that is that already taxed teachers became even more taxed because they were handling the students of the teacher who used the red card, so to speak, and left. And Ed and I kept saying, who helped the teacher with the red card? Where was that help? Was the expectation that that teacher would just like show back up the next day, put their red card in their drawer and hope it all went away? So you are right in the question that we did way more with student social and emotional learning than we did with educator social and emotional learning. And while both Ed and I have done workshops for educators on self-care, because you can't pour from an empty cup, that isn't something that we actually measured in this book, nor is it something for which we have the data in our survey. We do have plenty of anecdotal data based on the Virtual Teachers Lounge in terms of the struggles that educators have had. And it is worrisome. And not only that, just to top it all off, there is increased meanness now. Meanness, not just between students, but meanness between students and educator, and sometimes educator to students, and parents to educator. That has heightened the problems for educators. Ed?
I just want to add is that simply, we are all human. And so when we really talk about the social emotional experience, we also really look at the social emotional experience of teachers, during the pandemic. As a matter of fact, I also look at, the social emotional experience of teachers prior to the pandemic. When you look at, school shooting, right, that happens way before the pandemic. What is that experience like? What is that traumatic experience like, for teachers and school administrators and so forth? So, and I think that Maria raised a really good point and an interesting point is that can we assess that or do we pay attention to that? Now, there's also a lot of proxy measure in my world that do suggest, the deteriorating of mental wellness issues that are related to adults. In that sense, I'll just apply that to teachers and other individuals and not to as much as to teachers. But it is critical to say that we do need to pay attention to them. I think we actually thought about writing really a chapter or two about self-care because we recognize that experience. But I think we decided not to is because the book, was getting too long, and I don't think that we have to have another book about really it's dedicated to the teacher's experience rather than students' experience. I think they both go equally well and important to address.
So it sounds like a sequel's coming.
We'll see.
No promises, no promises.
All
Well, by
right.
the way,
No
this is a
problem.
funny aside. So the book ends with an epilogue, which is a conversation between Ed and me, in part because we used voices of educators throughout. And we wanted to end as we began, with voices, our voices. And, you know, the book itself is written in a somewhat more formal way, not hugely formal, but the dialogue at the end, the epilogue, is a conversation between us. And one of the questions was, Ed, to me, I kept asking you throughout this, are we going to write another book? And he says in this conversation, and you never answered. You might as well answer now. I
Don't
answered,
put me on the spot.
and I answered.
The reason that I engaged myself with this book is because I was on the panel with, Columbia Teachers College Press on Karen's second book. And because of that, it started again. She and I knew each other before then. Because of that, I think that we beginning to plant the seed, intentionally or not intentionally, right, to write this book. And then I think the pandemic happened. So in some sense, I'm going back to my other analogy earlier. We talk about, physical distancing and so forth. In some aspect, it actually pulled us closer, Karen and I. So when we saying, okay, what about the third book? Okay, all right, that sounds very interesting. And from my world too, I have to share with you about my lived experience, as I said, earlier, because that prompted me the importance to really highlight mental wellness is important in learning.
But you make a really good point.
And I'm still not answering your question.
But you're making a really good point. The book actually focuses on mostly, not all, but mostly on the mental wellness of students and student success. There is clearly a whole body of literature needed on educator, broadly defined educator, by the way, mental wellness and success. I mean, there needs to be that book.
Absolutely.
Natalie?
And you're not answering the question, as you know.
And that's okay. So I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat here kind of related to administrators. So kind of keeping on trend with looking at all of the stakeholders involved in education. I'm wondering how can leadership be improved? And also how can administrators support teachers in the classroom?
Okay.
Based on your work.
That is in the book. And there is a whole section on what kind of leaders we need now and why current leaders are not necessarily doing all that they can do to support the educators who are working with them. And we have a number of suggestions for the qualities that are needed for leaders who lead in a crisis. And basically, we live in a world of perma-crises. I mean, we have one crisis after another. I mean, it's not like there's a shortage of crises and like we have one a decade or something. We have all sorts of crises. And at one point in the book, we say, you got to contextualize all this. We live in a VUCA world, V-U-C-A, which is a term often used in the business industry. And while you can have different meanings for the V and the U and the C and the A, you can start with volatile, uncertain, changing, ambiguous, or anxiety provoking. We live in a world filled with issues. So our leaders, current leaders, many of them, not all of them, are struggling, and we need to help them. And we need to give them the skill sets you need to lead in a time of crisis. Ed?
You said it. I don't think I need to add more. I just noticed that one of the person, and I apologize, I use the term STEAM. Very easy. This is going to be very short. STEAM stands for science, technology, engineering, arts. That's the new one that I heard, that the emphasis, and mathematics. And I just want to share that with you. Maybe in addition to that, with that consultation in Asia, interesting enough, they are very interested now in terms of the social emotional learning, even the curriculum that we develop in the United States, because they really are thinking about, as I said, is the whole brain child development. This is not about just content, right? STEAM or even STEAM with an A. It is about who is this child socially and emotionally. They see that as a very critical part of education.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple questions here. Well, they're a little different, so I'm going to do them individually. So someone asks here, how can we begin to mend education when, especially now, when the witness is hell-bent on staying in ignorance or racism that education was born from? Tough one.
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Okay, so here's my answer. If you don't have hope that education can change, it won't. You actually have to believe that there are things that you can do that will improve education. And if you don't try, I think you allow the status quo to exist. And I'm going to give you an example from when I worked in government. I was one of the senior policy advisors to the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration. I constantly felt like I was bashing my head against a wall, which I was. And at one point, I met someone who I knew from my prior life, who is now a senator. And she said to me, "So, how are you doing?" We were speaking at the same event. "So, how are you doing now?" I said, "I'm absolutely flabbergasted that I can't get anything done. I'm trying to make major change." And she said, "You're trying to move the needle 180 degrees. Move it 2, 3, or 4 while you're here. That's 2, 3, or 4 that it wouldn't have moved had you not been here." So I would say that's changing my expectation, but I do have hope. I carry a hope stone with me, not a rock, a ceramic piece that says hope. I wish I had one here. And usually at presentations, I give one away. So if you stick your name in the chat thing, Natalie, I'll give one away. Natalie can get your name and address and I'll send you a hope stone, because that's what you need, hope. That's my answer to a really difficult and accurate question.
And I don't know the answer. I have to admit, I do not know the answer. I worked under both Republicans and Democratic leadership for many years. As a matter of fact, when I was appointed to the National Council, it was under Republican administration. The only thing that my true north is really, I think, was two things. Give the opposition to speak. And I do deep listening and reflection. And that worked for me for many years for both, public service as well as working in many, many, many communities that some of them don't agree with me either. So that was my operandi. I have to say, going back to my answers, I don't know. I just don't know how to do that. Am I going to do something differently? Probably not. I will still do what it worked. It works for me, but it's really a different time. I can spend another 2 hours just to talk about this, but I'm going to hold myself not to expand further. Looks like Karen, you have something you want to touch on?
Look, I don't think either of us are scared to put our necks out in terms of this book. This book runs counter to the narrative, right? The narrative is all about the negatives of the pandemic. This book is a counter narrative about the positives of the pandemic, if we have the courage to use them. Maybe I'm just that old, but it's okay to put your head on the chopping block, because if you don't, we'll never make progress. And I have to live, in the book, we talk about one of my earlier books. Somebody said to me, you know, you're putting your head on the chopping block here. I mean, this is 25 years ago. You know, you're gonna you'll have hell to pay. I said, okay, I'll have hell to pay. So there were some terrible reviews of that book. Fast forward 25 years, the book that was controversial to so many people is now basically the norm in that field. You just have to be able to withstand what happens across the passage of time.
I think that one of my secret strategy, maybe I shouldn't review this, it's that because in my world, and educational world is very different now, book banning and certain, curriculum is not appropriate. And, that's the challenge of all the educators and so forth. I really can feel it. You know what, though? One area, because when I was doing, the national work and so forth, I have many opportunities to speak and present my thesis from all different states of different color. When it comes to mental wellness, no one disagreed. And so my secret strategy about participating in this book, sharing my lived experience, is that when it comes to mental wellness, no one is going to say, I don't give a damn to my son and daughter's mental wellness. That is something, at least for parents, I think we all have agreement. So I kind of infiltrate from my perspective into education to say that these are important areas about your child. I'm not going to talk a lot about education. I'll leave that for Karen to talk about that because she's willing to stick her head out. I'm just saying, do you care? I mean, I don't ask them. Basically, they care. They care for their child or children. And I think there is an inroad for that. This is my kind of a cultural background, maybe a little bit, is kind of the jujitsu or the shadow boxing of you trying to get where you are going, period. I'm done.
Well, thank you both. We are running out of time here, so I'm still seeing questions in the chat, but we can have our team put both of your emails in the chat so that if there are questions that were unanswered, I'm sure you both are incredibly responsive and would want to continue that conversation further. So thank you both on behalf of the Proctor Institute for your insights, for your voice. It was an incredible talk today. Thank you to the attendees for being so engaging as well. And taking time out of your day to be here with us. I will mention that this recording will be sent out in addition to the slides, as well as Ed and Karen's contact information. And once again, the discount code is in the chat. It'll also be sent out in that email, including where you can pre-order the book on Teachers College Press. So thank you both so much. And I am so happy that we were able to have this conversation today.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.